The social unrest we've seen transpire with the Black Lives Matter movement is being viewed as a moment of awakening, catapulting racism to the forefront of national dialogue. Sheila, I'd like to start with you. Do you feel angry or hopeful of what we're seeing evolve here?
Both, actually. I think that this is a very good teachable moment for us to look at the truths and the reality, and we have to find a way out together as a nation. And time for anger is warranted, but also time for moving on and even reaching towards forgiveness and cooperation.
Chief Commissioner Landry, in your role as an independent watchdog of human rights issues in Canada, is racism systemic in this country, and how do we change that in this country?
Oh yes, racism is both. In fact, it's endemic and systemic. The roots of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and systemic discrimination in Canada run deep. That is what systemic racism means. That it has been historically embedded and has shaped our social, cultural, political, economic landscape for hundreds of years. It is built into our institutions and perpetuate the social and economic disparities that exist in everything from education to healthcare, housing, and employment. It's been there so long that it's hard for people to see it. But we need to see it, and we need to talk about it, and we need to speak out about it.
Absolutely. Bruce, if we look at recent cases of RCMP brutality in the Indigenous community, there's been about 3 examples of this past month alone. Prime Minister Trudeau said that there is, quote, systemic discrimination right across the country, like Deputy Commissioner Landry was saying, and that we must acknowledge that there is institutional racism in Canada. The RCMP is not immune. Do you feel the government has been overpromising and underperforming?
I think this speaks to an issue that particularly Indigenous people are all too familiar with across the country, is that you hear a lot of promises, but do you really see much delivery on the ground? The level of frustration that I see across the country is palpable, and it's that disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of lived lives for Indigenous people all across the country. And that's what needs to change.
Commissioner Landry, I just want to go back to you for a moment to Bruce's point. It's argued that Canada suffers from this silent form of racism. How, compared to its neighbors to the south in America, how dangerous is this feeling in terms of progression for this country?
I think that racism is everywhere. It's not exclusive to our neighbors. It's everywhere, and it's something that we all need to be aware of. This is something that we need to talk about, to speak about. This is something that we need to speak out about. And we all have to start by admitting that there is racism here in Canada. If we deny it, in fact, it's the first barrier to address it. And we all have, it's not about government or any organization, it's about all of us. We all have to ask ourselves difficult and uncomfortable questions about our own conscious or biases, about our behavior, about how we react. We all have to call out that the people around us, that they do not speak out about racism and they have some inappropriate propos or they are racist. We have to speak out about that. It's each and every one have this responsibility. It's not one entity who have this responsibility. And again, I repeat it because it's so important. Deny it. It's the first barrier to resolve this situation. Enough is enough. Talking, it's good, but now it's time to get in action and take concrete steps to address racism in this country.
Sheila, to Ms. Landry's point, this idea, this term that we're using right now a lot in media coverage, for example, unconscious bias. Do you think that that term alone softens the true essence of what racism is?
I think so. I think there is legitimate unconscious bias that we all grow up with. I have, unconscious biases myself about probably certain things or people or events. But for people that use it as an excuse to say that they didn't know or that they weren't aware is deplorable. And I think that people that do that are setting us back further from where we need to be. And one prime example is the RCMP head commissioner here in Canada, who called it unconscious bias and won't go ahead and say, yes, it is systemic, even though the Prime Minister has already recognized it and says that it's in there and it's in all institutions. So it's problematic that she's not able to see it. And I know that it is it's not completely without having people telling her what it was. And if she's confused, then I don't know what's wrong, because she has an Indigenous advisory circle. She has other advisors from the Indigenous community, and I was one of them. So I know for a fact that there have been papers and feedback given to her and the RCMP about what racism is and how it's historically been present in our relationships and what it's doing to our people. So she can't say she doesn't know. And I think this is a question of her choices and her leadership, because to say unconscious bias and not come out and say it's systemic racism and that we're going to root it out is not being brave. We have to be brave. This is a good teachable moment for all of us, and we have to take this opportunity to do that.
The RCMP always has these investigations, Chief Commissioner, and I'm curious to know, is there this fatigue that there's investigations and we'll look into it, but there's no tangible I guess results, if you could say that?
You certainly will understand that I cannot comment directly on that, because as a Chief Commissioner, I'm also a decision maker on a complaint about racism, and
Okay.
It's a difficult, but what I should say and what I want to say, it's time, there is come a time when silence is betrayal, like Martin Luther King Jr. was saying, and time is now. It's time to face the truth in Canada and everywhere. There is racism in Canada, and we can, it's just that we just have to see all the report or the studies about racial profiling in this country, which is Nova Scotia and Montreal and Toronto, and we have to face the truth. There is racial profiling.
I know you do a lot of work on the ground. Can you just give us some examples to put what's going on here in context?
We just have to think about the overrepresentation of the Black community and the Indigenous community in our judicial or criminal system, which is absolutely a big problem. The minimal mandatory sentence is another problem that targets specifically the Indigenous community and the Black community. There is a lot of example of that that need to be addressed.
You know where else I see it as well, sorry, Emily, is that we see it in the judicial system, we see it in our jails, the high numbers of incarceration rates of not only adults, of male and female, but young people. Our youth centers are filled with Indigenous kids. I went to visit a Manitoba Youth Center here, and I would say out of the 9 dorms with about 10 kids in each dorm, most of them, I think I saw 3 non-Indigenous kids in that whole area. So this is the precursor of the jail system, and that's huge. But where else it shows up is, people that don't understand or don't want to know what racism is or whatever, they want to deny it. They tell us, go get a job, go to school. But we don't have proper school systems on reserves, first of all. So we don't have access to good education that will lead us to being successful post-secondary students. For the most part, it's very hard when you meet an Indigenous person who has achieved good post-secondary, heights, then I would say bow to them, because they overcome a lot to get to that point. And same with jobs. We don't have access, for example, to become pilots, for example. It takes money, it takes time, and you usually have to have a good nest egg to do these kind of jobs. And we don't simply have that. We're economically starved in a lot of ways, and that's also systemic racism.
And we can look as well to add on what Sheila just mentioned. In fact, we can just look on the child welfare case, in fact, and the amount of young and children that have been deprived of the love of their parents because of the unfunded or the inappropriate way that the program have been funded. It's not normal that in a country where the Indigenous community is representing 7% of the population, that they're representing more than 49% of the population in the childcare system, which is not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, to Sheila's point earlier, I think the statistic is 1 in 4 federal inmates are Indigenous, and that makes up 4% of Canadians. 48% of children are in foster care. And so, Bruce, I want to get your reaction to that, and I want to know more, if you can tell us about the state of Indigenous sovereignty in this country.
I think it's really important for people to always be aware that Canada is based on a lie. It's based on a racist lie. The doctrine of discovery is the basis of the colonial state here in Canada. It's the basis of law in Canada, the Canadian legal system. It's alive and well. I think a lot of people around the world, they have a misconception of Canada, and some of it comes from a comparison, a false comparison to our friends south of the border. This is a racist country. It's historically a racist country. It's currently a racist country. And a lot of that, as you've heard, comes from denial. This common thread of denial, and there's a correlation between the denial of racism in Canada and the denial of Indigenous rights. Those are interwoven through Canadian history. They're part of what happens today, every day in Canada. And when you see Indigenous people fighting back, saying enough is enough, and the response they get is violence from the Canadian state against them, because it's threatening this lie of there are no Indigenous rights, or that the rights have been subsumed, or that we're all fine because there's been an apology. That's enough. Now we can move on again. That is a fundamental lie that needs to be dealt with by all Canadians.
Bruce, I'm going to come back to your point about the economics and social change here, but I want to just bring up the fact that's been discussed, I've heard discussed many times over, the fact that when this COVID-19 crisis happened, the government took tangible action, and we've seen them roll out multi-billion-dollar relief aid for this country. So that shows the will that the government can move quickly, they can act fast. Sheila, I just want to know your reaction to that, and do you think there's that will, what we're seeing now, do you think there will be that political will to see change from the government side and from the institutional side?
Well, we saw the same reaction when the pipelines were in trouble, right? And Canada went out and built a pipeline. So they do have a lot of will. And the other thing that I don't think people really talk about or notice, maybe they have, but for many years, the Indigenous Services Canada was INAC. For many years, how many, 50 years or something, close to 50 years? Or maybe is it 30? Anyway, they were a one unit for all this time. And at the will of the Prime Minister in the last few years, he split it into two. And it ballooned to be a bigger bureaucracy. And now it's in two parts. Even though I believe they went from $8 billion for funds to INAC, to the department, and now they're at 22 billion. But still, the people on the ground in First Nations don't have, they're still in the same living conditions. And this government and this bureaucracy has something to say about our lives from birth to death. And so, and we have no control, we have no say on what's being done and decisions being made on reserves about us. And so we're seeing people that are dying at the hands of government policies that are racist. As Bruce said, we're all based on a lie. And a lot of it has to do with simple old greed, that people want control, people want power, people want money, resources to be, you know, have more than their neighbors and to have more than the original people of this land, because you know, they've been convinced that we're nothing and that we're not valuable and that we should go away and all those ideas. And they're not going to go away too easily. But I do have hope, because 150 years ago, as I was told, we were meant to be extinct. 150 years later, here we are. And we're still now we're in every facet of society. Some of us are doctors and lawyers and, you know, in the media, and where we're going to be in 150 years if we keep going. So I see this as a moment in time. It's a very good moment. And I think we have to keep pushing for those changes that we all seek to see, at least the ones that are right thinking.
Chief Commissioner Landry, this moment in time, why do you think this has been so different from what we've seen in the past? Why does it seem like this has really caught on, obviously nationally and globally?
Well, I think that there is, it's you know, again, when the event that we have seen last 2 weeks ago regarding the death of George Floyd, I think that it's have been filmed. Everyone had the opportunity to see what happened. And in fact, I think that when we can see something like that, it just creates emotion, and emotion bring action. And I think that people cannot suffer anymore to see this kind of behavior, racist attitude toward minorities, and this kind of it's unacceptable. And it's time, again, I told it, it's enough is enough. It's time for education. It's time to learn. It's time to face the truth. It's time to admit that there is racism. And racist is not an identity, it's a behavior, it's an attitude toward people, you know. And I think that we need to ask again ourselves difficult and uncomfortable question. No one will like to be seen as a racist person, but we all have biases, and we need to admit it, and we need to work and fight against it. And I think that the video and the fact that we have this unfortunate opportunity to see what's happened 2 weeks ago just create this feeling. When you're seeing pain indirect, it's not something that you can accept. I don't think so. And I would say that as a grandmother of a little black son, I don't believe that it's normal on a Saturday evening during a dinner that I have to tell him that he should be careful, he should watch how he will behave, and he should act differently than any white young children. It's not normal. I think that the society should change, and it's time for that. And we need to seize this opportunity to address the racism in this country as everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sheila, I wanna come off of what Chief Commissioner Landry just said and look at the role of journalists in this space and in this realm and what we're seeing happening. I know that unless it's a story like we've seen with the Wet'suwet'en protests or the missing women and missing girls situation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whenever it's a main story, it comes up in news, and then after it goes through its cycle, it dies down, the story goes. Tell me what you think the role of the media is here for promoting equality in this country and around the world, I should say.
They play a very, very important role. And I think much like other systems, media, the justice, the health systems, all of it, they all face the same problem, in that there is systemic racism. And I think the other problem with the media and even politicians is they can't completely change their formats or their policies without support from the greater public. Unfortunately, it's the ones that support media or watch media are also the same ones posting hate on social media and all these platforms. So it's a huge societal problem that has to have a great shift. And media does have an important role to play by paying attention to, the smaller voices or the voices that don't normally get heard so often, and expand also the people that are telling the stories. When you close your eyes, I was given this example when I was first starting in the media. If you listen to the newscast and you close your eyes, everyone sounds the same. There's hardly any room for diversity. You might look and see a woman, you might see a dark face, but everyone sounds the same. And I can say for sure, when I was first starting in the media and my first live report, I naturally said, "Tanse, I'm Sheila North," which means hello, I'm Sheila North. But after 3 times or so, I was told by the producers, "Don't say Tanse. That's too hard to explain to people. We don't have time and they don't know what it means." And it was, I can't say it was beaten out of me, but it was sort of was. And because we don't have any room for diversity. But yes, we all have, as a society, we have this in all of the systems, and we've learned it from early ages to disrespect, to disregard, Indigenous people, especially in this country, and then also other racialized, and we don't call it out, and we have to at every turn and every level now.
Bruce, to Sheila's point about how we identify with ourselves and how people identify with us, I want to look at going back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the entire report, looking back at residential schools that only closed, the last one only closed in the 90s, and that's not very long ago. What does the term truth mean to you, and more so the term reconciliation in this context?
I think what I tell people all the time is that reconciliation isn't happening if it makes you feel good. It has to make you feel uncomfortable. Non-Indigenous people need to feel uncomfortable when they're dealing with reconciliation. Too often it's hugs and kisses and platitudes from politicians. It has to be a difficult conversation. And that's one of the positive things that's been coming out here in the last few weeks. People are feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. As the first step for reconciliation is first to admit that there is a situation and there is a problem in this country and there is racism. And it's also to say that it's not an Indigenous problem. It's a Canadian problem that we all need to step on the plate and address it. And this is the first step for reconciliation. It's acknowledging that things have happened, and this is the dark side of our story in Canada, and we need to address it.
Do you think that this country and the world, to a larger degree, will be able to build back in such a way where, especially if we look at the economy, we can bring these people who have been marginalized in previous times with us for the benefit of the country and the economy?
I continue to be hopeful. I hope that's where we go. Unfortunately, history doesn't give us good signs that that's where we'll end up. Just today, the news with different provinces across the country that are taking this as an opportunity to further marginalize Indigenous people. That's what's happening today. They're putting in place laws for, quote, economic development that'll have the opposite effect for Indigenous people. And that should be a huge concern all across the country.
Absolutely. What I just want to say, if there is one message that is also important, it's so easy for some people to take their rights for granted or look the other way when the face of injustice because we think that it didn't affect us. And we should never forget that we can never take rights for granted. We always have to fight for it. And rights should be for everyone and not just for some, like access to justice, like not having to face discrimination. It should be for everyone in this country. And this is something that we need to fight for. We need to move forward to build a country where everyone will feel that they belong and can have the same privilege and the same rights. This is what I just want to highlight. In fact, we should never take our right for granted, and everyone should benefit.
Sheila, do you want to weigh in on that? And are you hopeful that this is the moment we'll finally see that tangible change?
I'm always hopeful. And I saw a funny meme that said, you know, human rights is not a pie. Just because someone else is getting more doesn't mean there's less for you. Human rights is just can be afforded to everyone. And so I look at it that way. And the more respect and support that we show for each other in bigger groups, we can outnumber the bigots and the racists that have a lot of learning to do.
Well, Chief Commissioner Landry, Mr. Bruce McIvor, Sheila North, thank you very much for joining us at Collision from Home.